The room had radiators that clanked and a smell of wet wool, because every building in that part of Belgium smelled of wet wool that winter. Along one wall stood the map boards, sheets of acetate laid over printed sheets of Belgium and the German border country, and on the acetate a grease pencil had drawn the enemy. Solid outlines were confirmed, a lighter mark for suspected, small rectangles with numbers inside them, and every rectangle in that row was a German division that somebody had earned by interrogating a prisoner or reading a photograph, or sitting in a truck for 11 hours listening to a radio net. At the far end of the room, a mimeograph was turning. What came off it ran to a few pages, and it carried a number on its face, because these documents were serialized the way invoices are serialized in a business. This one was the 37th. A colonel had written it, and it did the thing intelligence documents almost never do. It named the ground. It put a bracket on the map, running from Roermond, in the Netherlands, down to Schleiden, just inside Germany, and it said that inside that bracket, the German army was about to spend everything it had been saving. The date on it was December 10th, 1944. 6 days later, the German army came out of the fog with 3 armies, and the bracket was wrong. Not wrong about the blow, wrong about the door. The southern edge of that bracket sat almost exactly on the northern shoulder of the attack that came, and the rest of it, another 50 miles of front running south into the Ardennes, lay outside the bracket entirely. That is the part that gets lost, and the loss is not an accident. This battle is filed in the American memory under the word surprise, and that one word does an enormous amount of work because it excuses everybody at the same time. Nobody knew. How could anybody have known? 3 men knew something. A colonel at First Army, a colonel at Third Army, and a British major general at Eisenhower's own headquarters. Across the 6 weeks that ended on the 16th of December, all 3 of them put on paper that the Germans had pulled a large armored reserve out of the line, had not spent it, and had the physical means to use it wherever they chose. All 3 wrote it down in dated documents that still exist and that anybody can go and read. None of the 3 changed anything. I want to be careful with this from the first minute, because the easy version of the story is false. The easy version has 3 prophets calling it exactly, and a room full of fools waving them off. That is not what the documents show. What the documents show is worse than that, and more useful, and much closer to the way large headquarters actually fail. The warnings existed. There was no machine for acting on them. The names are Benjamin Dickson, Oscar Koch, and Kenneth Strong. If those names mean nothing to you, that is not a hole in your reading. It is a hole in the record, and the record was assembled afterward by men with a considerable interest in the word surprise. To understand how 3 warnings can be correct and useless at the same time, you have to start with the shape of the Allied front in the last week of October 1944, and with something nobody remembers as a decision. By then, the pursuit across France was 4 months dead. The Allied armies had run out of fuel short of the German border in September, and what followed was not a campaign of movement, but a set of grinding frontal battles at the 2 shoulders of the front. In the north, First Army was feeding divisions into Aachen and then into the Hürtgen forest. In the south, Third Army was in the mud around Metz. Between those 2 efforts lay 100 miles of forested high ground straddling Belgium, Luxembourg, and the German Eifel, and that ground was held thin on purpose. The reasoning was not stupid, and I'm going to insist on that, because the cartoon version of this battle requires the Ardennes to have been left thin by accident or by arrogance. It was neither. It was arithmetic. Eisenhower was attacking at both ends of the line, and every division committed at the ends was a division not available in the middle. Forrest Pogue, in the Green Book volume, The Supreme Command, laid out the terrain judgment plainly. The Ardennes was not thought suitable for mobile warfare, and least of all in winter, when bad weather would make an already poor road net worse than usual. The forest was a wall. You do not garrison a wall, so the middle became a rest area. Divisions that had been used up somewhere else went there to be rebuilt, and divisions that had never been anywhere went there to learn what a front line smelled like. The 28th Infantry Division came out of the Hürtgen forest and into the Ardennes carrying the wreckage of about 9,000 battle casualties, and it spent its time in the quiet, holding a river line, and training the replacements who had arrived to fill those holes. That is the shape of the sector. A wall, held by men who were either exhausted or brand new, with a corps headquarters at Bastogne trying to make the arithmetic work. Now put the 3 intelligence officers into that picture, because their positions in the machine matter more than their personalities. An army group has a G2. An army has a G2, so does a corps and a division, and every regiment has an S2, and the whole structure exists to push information up and orders down. Benjamin Dickson sat at First Army, which held the northern half of the American line, including the northern half of the Ardennes. Oscar Koch sat at 3rd Army in Lorraine, whose left flank ended where the Ardennes began. Kenneth Strong sat at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which is to say he was Eisenhower's intelligence chief, and answered to Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith. Between Dickson and Koch on one side and Strong on the other stood one more man, and he is the hinge of this entire story, even though almost nobody says his name. Brigadier General Edwin Seibert was the intelligence officer at 12th Army Group, Omar Bradley's headquarters. Everything 1st Army and 3rd Army knew about the Germans went up through him. Everything Bradley was told about the Germans came out of him. Hold that structure in your head. 3 men in 3 rooms, none of whom could order anything, all of whom reported to somebody who could. I think the most useful thing you can do with these 3 officers is stop treating them as one story, because they were not alike, and their situations were not alike, and the differences are the whole point. Benjamin Abbott? Dickson was born in 1897, went to West Point in 1916, and graduated in 1918, and picked up the nickname Monk there because he could not stand compulsory chapel. He rode the Mexican border, went to Russia with the American Expeditionary Force, and then in 1920 he did something very few regular officers did. He resigned his commission and went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to study mechanical engineering, and he spent the interwar years as a civilian engineer. He came back on active duty in October of 1940, and he became Bradley's intelligence officer in Tunisia and Sicily before landing at 1st Army, where he stayed after Bradley moved up to Army Group in August of 1944, and Courtney Hodges took over. That North African apprenticeship is where Dickson's problem starts. He had a reputation among his superiors for sounding alarms, and in the desert he had sounded a number of them about Rommel that did not come off. Somebody at Bradley's headquarters eventually hung a portrait of Hitler on the wall with a caption written under it, and Thomas Dorschach's land warfare paper for the Association of the United States Army preserves the wording. He fools some of the people some of the time, but he fools Dickson all of the time. It was a joke, and it was funny, and it is also a precise description of an institutional condition. When the man who cries wolf is a standing joke in the headquarters above him, the headquarters has quietly decided in advance what it will do the next time he shouts. Oscar Koch came at the job from the opposite direction. He enlisted in Milwaukee in 1915, took his commission as an artillery officer on the 15th of April, 1918, and worked his way up through the interwar cavalry and armored force. He was Patton's intelligence officer at 2nd Armored Division, went with him to North Africa and Sicily, and ran 3rd Army's G2 section from the beginning of the campaign in France. Koch was not a personality, he was a process man. He built what he called a G2 planning cycle, which meant that every activity, every duty, and every responsibility in the section was written down and owned by somebody, and he ran an all-source shop at a time when that phrase had barely been invented, pulling air photographs, prisoner interrogations, captured documents, civilian reports, and signals material into one picture instead of 3. Kenneth William Dobson Strong was British, and that matters to this story in ways I will come back to. He took a commission in the Royal Scots Fusiliers in July of 1920, served in Ireland as an intelligence officer, spent 4 years with the British Army of the Rhine in the 1920s, and then from 1937 until war broke out, he was assistant military attaché at the British Embassy in Berlin. He had watched the Wehrmacht being built in person, in daylight, from a folding chair. In August of 1939, he took over the German section of M114, the War Office branch that studied the German Army. Eisenhower took him as intelligence chief at Allied Force headquarters in North Africa in March of 1943, and brought him to SHAEF as G2 on the 25th of May, 1944, where he served until the end of the war in Europe. So one engineer who had been mocked for years, one process officer whose commander happened to trust him, and one professional Germanist who had been inside the machine he was now trying to predict. Now watch what all 3 of them saw in the same 6 weeks. At the beginning of October, Schaef noticed that the German 7th Army was withdrawing armor from the line and concluded that a Panzer Army would soon emerge somewhere behind the front. By late October, Pogue records, Schaef had gone further. The Germans, it judged, would collect a reserve of Panzer and parachute units with which they could attack, probably in the north. That is the assessment that would poison everything downstream, and notice that it is not a failure to see the reserve. The reserve was seen, the direction was assumed. Koch was watching the same withdrawal from Lorraine and counting it division by division. By the end of October, he had identified 4 Panzer divisions refitting near Paderborn, far to the north of 3rd Army's boundary and none of his direct business. By the 10th of November, the Germans had pulled 5 more panzer divisions out of the line. Of the 15 panzer divisions in the west, only 5 were still in contact with Allied forces by the middle of November. 10 armored divisions had gone somewhere and stopped fighting, which in a war of attrition is an event, not a lull. And then it got more specific. Starting on the 17th of November, aerial reconnaissance began picking up heavy German rail movement north of Third Army's projected zone of advance. On the 18th of November alone, 226 trains. Over the whole late November and early December period, more than 500 Allied reconnaissance sorties over the German concentration areas found rail traffic far above normal, on the order of 10,000 carloads. On the 23rd of November, Koch identified the new formation by name, 6th Panzer Army, with 5 of its reconstituted panzer divisions. Schaeff saw the same thing and read it the same way, up to a point. In the middle of November, it described the German effort in forming 5 panzer and 5 parachute divisions as a truly colossal effort, and concluded that the enemy was preparing for a final showdown before the winter. Then it did the thing that mattered. It assumed logically that the showdown would come against the Allied thrusts building up north of the Eifel, because that was where the Allies were threatening something the Germans could not afford to lose. Every one of those judgments is defensible. Put together, they built a wall in the mind exactly where the wall in the ground already was. Somebody noticed. On the 25th of November, according to David Zabecki's article on Patton at Bastogne, Patton wrote in his diary that First Army was making a terrible mistake leaving the 8th Corps static, and that it was highly probable the Germans were building up east of them. That is 9 days before December and 3 weeks before the attack, and it is not intelligence. It is a commander reading his own intelligence officer and drawing an inference nobody had asked him for. Dickson was doing the same arithmetic at Spa and reaching the same general place from the other side of the boundary. Peter Caddick Adams, in Snow and Steel, credits him with warnings running through November. But Dickson's problem was not what he saw. It was that his estimates had to survive a journey up a chain of command that had already made a joke out of his name. Quick note before the next part. A book of 100 American commanders, admirals, and airmen. Same entry for all 100. Final rank, commands, operations, decorations, fate, then what the record holds against what was claimed. 716 credited photographs, all of them again in color. High command to ww2.com, back to early December. On the 3rd of December, Schaeff picked up tank movements coming from the Rhine toward Bitburg in the Eifel, which is to say directly opposite the Ardennes. That is 13 days out. The report went into the system. On the 9th of December, Oskar Koch stood up in front of Patton and the Third Army staff and gave the briefing that his reputation now rests on. And it is worth being precise about what he actually said, because it has been inflated in the retelling, and it does not need inflating. Koch did not say the Germans would attack the Ardennes on the 16th. He said that a large German armored force had been assembled in reserve out of contact, that 13 reserve divisions were identified in the Eifel region, including 5 panzer divisions and 6 parachute divisions, and that the enemy, therefore, had the definite capability of mounting an offensive at a moment of his own choosing. He walked the staff through combat strength, terrain, and friendly dispositions. He told them the enemy held a 2-to-1 advantage in that sector and carried a psychological edge from a recent successful diversionary attack. And he put down the single number that should have ended the argument. Koch told Patton he had identified 9 German divisions opposite the 8th Corps. That was almost 3 divisions more than were facing the entire Third Army. Sit with that comparison, because it is the hardest fact in this story, and it comes from a named officer's own briefing. The Third Army was the formation actually attacking. Third Army was where the Germans had every reason to concentrate, and Third Army's own intelligence officer was telling his commander that the quiet sector on his left flank had more German divisions in front of it than his whole army did. Against that, Third Army had 3 infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions available for immediate employment. That is what Koch put on the table. Patton listened, and after silence, he said that they would be in a position to meet whatever happened. He kept his own offensive on the calendar, which was the correct decision, and is often held against him by people who want a cleaner hero. Then, on the 12th of December, he did the thing nobody else in this story did. He told his chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, and his operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, to drop specific contingency plans for a Third Army counterattack in the event of a major German penetration into the 8th Corps. Not a warning. A plan, with a filing number sitting in a drawer. The next day, the mimeograph at Spa was running off estimate number 37, and here is what it actually said in the passage that survives in the official history. von Rundstedt, it read, who obviously is conducting military operations without the benefit of intuition, has skillfully defended and husbanded his forces, and is preparing for the all-out application of every weapon at the focal point. Pogue's volume sets out where First Army put that focal point, between Roermond and Schleiden, with the armored reserve assembling near Cologne, ready to be thrown in at the focal point and at the correct time. Read that sentence again and notice what is right about it, because a great deal is right. The reserve is real. It is being saved on purpose. It will be used all at once, at one place, when the Germans decide. The mechanism is described accurately 6 days before it operated. Now notice the two things that are wrong. The bracket points north of where the blow fell, and the estimate assumed the blow would be aimed at the Allied force judged the greatest threat to the defense of the Reich, which meant the armies driving toward Cologne and the Ruhr. Hugh Cole, whose Ardennes Battle of the Bulge is the Army's own official account, records that First Army placed the 6th Panzer Army rather indefinitely between the Ruhr and the Rhine. 12th Army Group thought it might be concentrating around Bielefeld, northeast of Cologne. Everybody had the army, nobody had the Axis. Here's where the institutional part starts, and it gets ugly fast. On the 10th of December, the same day Estimate 37 went out, Scheff's own intelligence summary told its readers that there was no further news of the 6th SS Panzer Army beyond vague rumors. One headquarters is calling a formation the centerpiece of a coming offensive. The headquarters above it is calling the same formation a rumor. 2 days later, on the 12th of December, 12th Army Group issued the intelligence summary that ought to be carved into a wall somewhere as a warning to staff officers. It is now certain, Seibert's section wrote, that attrition is steadily sapping the strength of German forces on the Western Front, and that the crust of defenses is thinner, more brittle, and more vulnerable than it appears on our G2 maps or to the troops in the line. It is now certain. 4 days before the attack, the headquarters standing between two Army-level intelligence sections and the Supreme Commander told everybody that the German Army was more broken than the maps showed. Not that it might be, that it was certain. And then it got worse, because the same headquarters had a map. On the 15th of December, 12th Army Group's situation map showed, for the entire stretch of front from the Moselle to Monschau, 5 German divisions, with a 6th apparently withdrawing from the Eifel. Koch had put 9 in front of one corps. The Army Group map showed 5 in front of the whole sector, which brings us to Kenneth Strong and to the most quoted 3 words in this story. Strong's own reading in early December was that the Germans might send their armored reserve to the Eastern Front, or use it for a counterattack in the West. Carlo d'Este, in Eisenhower, A Soldier's Life, characterizes the Scharfe position as a warning of a possible disruptive German spoiling attack somewhere in the Ardennes during a period of bad weather. That is not a prediction of an Army Group offensive aimed at Antwerp, and Strong never claimed it was. But it named the ground, and it named the weather, and both were correct. Walter Bedell Smith took it seriously enough to act. He sent Strong from Scharfe to Bradley's headquarters to deliver the warning in person, and Bradley's answer was 3 words long. Let them come. I think that reply has been quoted to death and misread almost every time. It is usually read as arrogance. Read in context, it is something more troubling. It is a considered position. Bradley's view was that a German attack into the Ardennes would run into a trap of its own making, that it would take the Germans out of the Siegfried Line fortifications and into open country where American air power and American mobility would kill them, and that the appropriate response to the threat was therefore to accept it. That is a real argument. It is even partly what happened. What it was not was a plan, and it was not communicated downward as a decision that anybody was required to prepare for. And on the 14th of December, Dickson made his most specific call. Charles B. MacDonald's account in A Time for Trumpets has him pointing at the Ardennes and asking for Allied bombing of the German rail lines feeding the sector. The request went to Karl Spaatz, and it was refused. Then Benjamin Dickson got into a car and went to Paris on leave to celebrate a birthday that fell on the 18th. In my view, that leave is the most honest fact in this entire story, and it is the fact that should stop anybody from writing the 3 men up as prophets. If Dickson believed on the 14th of December that a German army group was 48 hours from coming through the sector next door, he did not act like a man who believed it. He behaved exactly as a staff officer behaves when he has filed a serious concern through the proper channel and considers his duty discharged. Which is to say, he behaved like an employee of a functioning bureaucracy, in a week when the bureaucracy was about to fail. Now I want to slow down and show you how one of these estimates physically worked, because I believe this is the real answer to the question in the title, and it is not in most accounts of the battle. An Army G2 produced 2 kinds of paper. The first was the daily periodic report, a running account of what had been seen in the last 24 hours. Unit identifications, prisoner takes, air observation, patrol contacts. The second was the numbered estimate, produced when the picture changed enough to be worth a formal document. Both were typed, cut onto stencils, run off on a mimeograph, and distributed down to subordinate corps and divisions and up to the next headquarters. That is the whole apparatus: paper, a machine, and a courier. Now the part that decides everything. The Army's field manual on combat intelligence was explicit about what belonged in that document. Commanders were to base their actions on estimates of enemy capabilities rather than on estimates of enemy intentions, because intentions can seldom be determined. Orders change. False orders get issued on purpose. So the doctrinally correct estimate ends not with a prediction, but with a list of the things the enemy is physically able to do. That doctrine is right. It is still right. And it has a hole in it that this battle drove a panzer army through. A capability is not a decision. A list of enemy capabilities is a menu handed to a commander, and the doctrine assumed the commander would price the items on it. But nothing in the system required a higher headquarters to answer a subordinate headquarters estimate at all. Dickson's document went up to 12th Army Group as information, not as a question, not as a request for a decision. Nobody at Army Group had to write back, nobody had to log a response, and no procedure existed by which an Army G2 who thought his warning was being ignored could escalate it. Bradley later described the result in his own memoir with a candor that does him credit. His own G2 at Army Group, Brigadier General Seibert, was not sufficiently impressed by these reports to come to him with a warning. That is the machine, described from the top by the man at the top. The paper existed. The filter sat between the paper and the decision, and the filter was a single officer's judgment with no obligation to record why he had exercised it. Now stack the collection failures on top of the reporting failure, because they compound. Aerial reconnaissance for 1st Army was flown by the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group of the 9th Tactical Air Command. In the month before the attack, that group flew 361 missions, of which 242 were judged successful, and it was finding things. In the last week of November, the number of enemy columns on the roads rose sharply. On the 30th of November, American reconnaissance pilots reported a drastic increase in rail activity west of the Rhine, hospital trains massing on the West Bank, flat cars carrying Tiger tanks, 50 searchlights in one location, which is not a defensive posture. It is a night movement aid. Then look at the critical week. From the 10th through the 15th of December, the group flew 71 missions. Of those, exactly 3 were flown directly opposite the 8th Corps, and the one on the 14th of December went over Trier. On the 13th, every American air reconnaissance mission in the sector was grounded by weather. Divisions in the line had been asking for coverage of the Eifel for days, and it went in behind higher priorities, because the priorities were set by the offensives at the ends of the line. 3 sorties in 6 days over the ground where 3 German armies were assembling. That is not a failure of analysis. Nobody can analyze a photograph that was never taken, and the Germans were working extremely hard to make sure it stayed that way. Kohl's official history lays out the security regime in detail. A radio blackout was thrown over the entire concentration area, with the sole exception of units already facing the enemy in the covering positions, which meant the radio traffic the Allies could hear was exactly the traffic that would have sounded normal. Rail movements and road marches were confined to hours of darkness by strict traffic control. No artillery registration was permitted, except by guns already in the line, and even those were limited to a few rounds a day, so that the batteries moving in could not be located by the one method that never fails, which is listening to them shoot. Here is the detail I would put in front of anybody who thinks the Germans in 1944 were an amateur operation. To get the guns into position without engine noise, they borrowed horses from the neighboring infantry artillery regiments and packed straw around the wheels to muffle them, which is precisely what their fathers had done in 1918. Kohl's line about the rest of it is that camouflage had stopped being an art for the German soldier in the West and become the science of survival, and that the Eifel made the job easy. There is one more collection channel to account for, and it is the one most people assume solved every problem the Allies had in this war: Ultra. The standing image of Allied intelligence in 1944 is a country house in England reading the enemy's mail, and for most of that year the image is accurate. Ultra had been decisive in Normandy. It had given away the Mortain counterattack in time to break it. Staffs in the field had learned, without ever writing it down as a policy, to treat the absence of a signal as the absence of a threat. Then the Germans took the offensive off the air. MacDonald records the radio silence order that was imposed on every matter concerning the coming attack. Inside Germany, orders moved by telephone, by teleprinter, and by officer courier, which are the three methods a code breaker cannot touch. And the wireless traffic that remained was the routine chatter of units already in the line. Danny Parker, in Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's Ardennes offensive, puts the daily decrypt volume at 40 to 50 messages even in that period. And they were not empty. They carried references to a fighter deployment, a Jägeraufmarsch, which is not a thing a defending air force needs. They carried extensive rail and road movement orders. They carried the shape of something being assembled. What they did not carry was an axis and a date, and those are the only two things a corps commander can actually use. So the most productive code-breaking operation of the war delivered, in the weeks before the largest German offensive of the war in the West, a set of true statements that no commander could act on. And I believe the deeper damage was to expectations rather than to the picture. An organization that has been spoiled by a perfect source learns to distrust every other source. And by December of 1944, the American and British staffs in the field had spent 5 months being right because a machine in England told them so. When the machine went quiet, the habit of waiting for it did not. That security regime worked, and there's a way to measure exactly how well. Before the 16th of December, the 8th Corps identified 4 of the 10 German divisions assembling in front of it. In the 5th Corps zone to the north, the 99th Infantry Division identified 3 of the 12 divisions massing to its front. 2/3 of the attacking force in both sectors was invisible, and the last 2 days produced the indicators that would break your heart if you read the files cold. On the evening of the 15th of December, 4 German prisoners came in, 2 taken by the 4th Infantry Division and 2 by the 106th. 1 at 1830 hours, 1 at 1930 hours, 2 later. All 4 said the same thing. Fresh troops were arriving in the line, a big attack was coming, it might come on the 16th or the 17th, and it would certainly come before Christmas. 2 of them were deserters, and here is the detail nobody quotes. The deserters themselves did not take it seriously because, as they told their captors, all this had been promised to German troops before. 3 of the 4 sounded like men repeating camp rumor, which is what most prisoners sound like, and they were put into the cages without further action. The 28th Infantry Division reported increased vehicle noise on the nights before the attack, and then discounted its own report in the same paragraph, on the entirely reasonable grounds that this is what an enemy frontline relief sounds like, and the same thing had happened 3 weeks earlier when a German unit pulled out. In the 106th, which had been in the line for 4 days, a regimental commander told his S2 off for describing the noise as enemy movement. Meanwhile, the 3 German communications intelligence companies working under Army Group B were filing reports of their own, and they were satisfied. American carelessness with radio and commercial telephone was up to par, they wrote, and no reinforcements were moving toward the Ardennes. On the 15th, German intelligence noted that the enemy's lack of interest in this sector was underlined by how little aerial reconnaissance was flying over it. Both sides were reading the same silence. Only one of them was right about what it meant. And there is one more reason the estimates read the way they read, which has nothing to do with any American officer's judgment and everything to do with what the Germans were actually attempting. The operation was named twice, and both names were chosen to be misread. Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, is the title of a patriotic song about standing guard on a river, which is to say, it announces a defensive posture. When the plan was revised, the cover name became Herbstnebel, autumn mist, which is weather. Under those 2 harmless words sat 3 armies, 6th Panzer Army in the north under Sepp Dietrich, built around the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions with parachute divisions attached. 5th Panzer Army in the center under Hasso von Manteuffel, which is the one that would reach farthest. 7th Army in the south under Erich Brandenberger, 4 infantry divisions whose whole job was to hold the southern shoulder open. And the objective written on the plan was Antwerp, which meant crossing the Meuse, then driving another 100 miles across Belgium in winter, splitting 2 Allied army groups and taking a working port. Now think about what that does to an intelligence officer whose doctrine tells him to estimate capabilities. A capability is what the enemy can physically achieve. On every measurement available in early December, the German army in the west could not achieve Antwerp. It did not have the fuel, which is why its lead formations ran dry short of the Meuse. It did not have the air cover, which is why the whole plan was hostage to overcast. It did not have the road net, and its own commander said so at the time in an argument the official history sets out at length. Manteuffel and Model both pressed for a smaller operation aimed at the Aachen salient, and Hitler refused them. So the correct capability estimate, produced by a competent professional in the second week of December, was that the Germans could mount a heavy local counteroffensive and could not mount a strategic one. That estimate was right. The Germans mounted a strategic one anyway, and it failed for exactly the reasons the estimate implied it would fail, after killing and capturing tens of thousands of Americans on the way to failing. In my view, that is the single most uncomfortable fact in the whole case, because it means the analysis was sound, and the analysis was useless in the same breath. Doctrine told these men to assume a rational enemy. The enemy was not being rational. He was being desperate, which is a different input, and no field manual in 1944 had a paragraph for it. At 0530 hours on the 16th of December, along the whole front from Monschau south to the Luxembourg border, the German artillery opened. The total assigned strength of the 8th Corps that morning was 68,822 officers and men, holding a front of about 85 miles. Cole's figure divides that among 3 infantry divisions, with a combat command of the 9th Armored Division still inexperienced, having taken over a narrow sector on the 10th of December. Do the arithmetic, and you get roughly 800 men per mile of front, which is not a defensive line. It is a tripwire with a headquarters behind it. At the northern end of that tripwire stood the 106th Infantry Division, which had finished relieving the 2nd Infantry Division in the Schnee-Eifel sector on the 12th of December, 4 days earlier. Robert Citino, writing on the fall of the Golden Lions for the National World War II Museum, puts the division's frontage with the attached cavalry at 18 miles as the crow flies, and closer to 21 on the ground, more than double the width a division of that period was supposed to hold. In the center, on the ridge road the Americans called Skyline Drive, the 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Division held a zone 9 to 10 miles wide. Cole's dry note on the arithmetic is that the 110th's front was about 2 miles wider than the front, assigned to the German Panzer Corps attacking it. 3 divisions came at that one regiment, the 26th Volksgrenadier, the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr, all under the 47th Panzer Corps. The 110th lost about 2,750 officers and men. Nobody relieved it, and nobody was going to, and what it bought with those men was 2 days on the road to Bastogne. To the north, the 106th was cut apart in 48 hours. On the 19th of December, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, roughly 7,000 men, surrendered on the orders of their own regimental commanders, Colonel George Deschenaux and Colonel Charles Cavender, after running out of ammunition in a pocket nobody could reach. Citino calls it the most serious reverse suffered by American arms in the European campaign, and he is careful, correctly, to hang it on the operational situation rather than on the division. Between those two sectors, in the break in the high ground called the Losheim Gap, sat the 14th Cavalry Group, screening. A cavalry group screens. It reports and it delays and it withdraws, and it is not a defense, and everybody involved knew that. The gap was the boundary seam between 2 divisions and between 2 corps at the same time, which is the worst kind of ground to be responsible for, because a seam belongs to nobody in particular. 6th Panzer Army came through it. North of the seam, the story went the other way. And this is where the American Army earned back what its intelligence had lost. In the 5th Corps zone, the 99th Infantry Division, which was itself green, held on the wooded ridges in front of Elsenborn long enough for the 2nd Infantry Division to turn around. The 2nd had been pulled off the Schnee-Eifel positions the week before, which is why the 106th was standing there in the first place, and it fought the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rosherath and refused to be pushed off the ridge. Cole gives that fight a chapter title that says everything about what it accomplished. The German northern shoulder is jammed. That jam is the reason 6th Panzer Army, the stronger of the 2 armored armies, never got the road net it had been given, and it happened in the first 72 hours with no plan by 2 divisions that improvised it. Eisenhower's own response came fast, and it is the best thing in the American record that week. On the evening of the 16th, he released the 7th Armored Division from 9th Army in the north and a combat command of the 10th Armored from 3rd Army in the south, over Patton's objection, and within 2 days he had committed the entire theater reserve, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, out of Reims. The 7th Armored went to St. Vith, the 10th Armored's combat command and the 101st went to Bastogne, the 82nd went to Wehrmacht to stand in front of the deepest SS penetration. Look at what that sequence is. Inside 36 hours, the theater did roughly what a written contingency plan would have told it to do. It moved armor to the 2 road centers and threw its only reserve at the shoulders. The difference between doing that from a plan and doing it from a standing start is measured in the hours between the first shell and the first order. And in December of 1944, those hours were paid for by rifle companies, and First Army's own command post had to move. The headquarters at Spa, where Estimate 37 had come off the mimeograph 6 days earlier, was inside the threatened corridor and was pulled out within days. The room went into trucks. There is no better single image of what an intelligence failure costs than a G2 section packing its own map boards, because the thing it wrote about is coming up the road. This is where the honest comparison has to be made, and it is brutal. On the 19th of December at Verdun, Eisenhower asked his commanders when they could counterattack. Patton said 3 divisions and named a date 2 days out. Eisenhower thought it was fantasy and pushed him to the 22nd. Third Army attacked on the 22nd of December with 3 divisions on a 20-mile front, roughly 66 hours after the meeting broke up, having turned a large part of an army through 90 degrees in winter on a road net that was already carrying everything else. That was not improvisation, and it was not genius. It was the plan Patton had ordered drawn on the 12th of December, because Koch had briefed him on the 9th. The paperwork existed. The staff had already argued about the routes. All that was needed on the 19th was permission. And if that pattern sounds familiar, if you have watched an organization ignore a written warning from a specialist, and then treat the one manager who quietly prepared for it as a genius rather than as somebody who simply did his job, you are not imagining a resemblance. The mechanism is the same, and it is older than any of us. The Germans got as far as their fuel allowed. On Christmas Day, the reconnaissance battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division and part of its artillery column sat at Foy Notre Dame, 4 or 5 miles from the bridges at Dinant on the Meuse, with tanks that had very little gasoline and a radio reporting dwindling ammunition and no fuel at all. That was the high watermark of the last German offensive in the West, and it stopped for the reason Koch and Dickson and Strong had all understood about the German army in 1944, which is that it could still generate a punch and could no longer pay for one. What happened to the 3 men afterward is the part of this story that decides what it means. Benjamin Dickson came back from Paris on the 16th, went back to work, and stayed First Army's G2 through the Roer, the Rhine, and the Elbe until Germany surrendered. He left the army on the 19th of November, 1945, still a colonel. He never wore a star. He never published a book. Of the 3 men in this story, he is the only one whose own version of December is not sitting on a shelf somewhere with his name on the spine. He died in 1976 in Devon, Pennsylvania, and he is buried at West Point. I want to be exact about what he did and did not do, because he has been used badly by both sides. Dickson did not predict the Battle of the Bulge. He predicted a concentrated German armored counteroffensive using a husbanded reserve at a single focal point at a time of the enemy's choosing, which is a genuinely impressive piece of analysis, and he put the focal point in the wrong place. He also had a record of alarms that had not come off, which is why the correct one carried no weight. Both of those things are true at once, and any account that gives you only one of them is selling you something. Oscar Koch finished the war as Patton's G2, was promoted to brigadier general, and then did the most consequential thing in his career, which almost nobody knows about. He organized the Army's first peacetime intelligence school at Fort Riley, Kansas. The methods he had improvised in a tent in Lorraine, the all-source picture, the written planning cycle, the named owner for every function, went into a schoolhouse and became doctrine. He retired in 1954 and died in 1970. His account of the work, G2, Intelligence for Patton, written with Robert Hayes, appeared in 1971, the year after his death. The Army inducted him into its Military Intelligence Hall of Fame in 1993 and named a barracks after him. Kenneth Strong was knighted, and after the war, he built the Joint Intelligence Bureau and was its first head, then served as Director General of Intelligence at the British Ministry of Defence in the middle 1960s. He wrote 2 books about the trade, Intelligence at the Top and Men of Intelligence. On the Ardennes, he did not defend himself with footwork. His own assessment was that the Allies had been completely fooled. Walter Bedell Smith, who had been in the room and who had sent him to Luxembourg, defended him afterward on the grounds that Strong had given ample warning and it had been discounted or disregarded. Notice what those 3 careers have in common. Not one of the 3 was relieved. All 3 finished the war in the job they had held in December, and 2 of the 3 went on to build the institutional intelligence machinery of their own countries afterward. That is not a story about scapegoats. It is something stranger and more revealing. The system that failed in December did not conclude that its intelligence officers had failed. It concluded that the enemy had done something unreasonable, which was true, and then it quietly went and fixed the part it had actually noticed was broken. That is worth spelling out, because it is the closest thing to a happy ending here. Koch's schoolhouse at Fort Riley is the American Army, admitting on paper that intelligence work is a process with owners rather than a talent some officers happen to have. Strong's Joint Intelligence Bureau is the British doing the same thing at national level, building a standing body whose entire job is to assemble one picture out of several services reporting. Both men spent their post-war careers building the receiving apparatus whose absence had cost them December. Neither of them ever put it that way in public, as far as the record shows, and I am reading intent into a coincidence when I say it. I still think the coincidence is worth naming. I think the Commonwealth side of this story deserves better than it usually gets, and this is the place to say it. In the American telling, the intelligence failure before the Ardennes very often gets pinned on the Englishman at Chez F, and the shape of that argument should make anybody suspicious, because it is extremely convenient. The record does not support it. Strong flagged a possible attack in the Ardennes in bad weather. Bedell Smith, an American, believed him enough to send him 100 miles to say it in person. The American Army Group commander heard it and said, "Let them come." And the sharpest single indictment of the whole business came from another Englishman, Noel Annan, a British officer who worked inside Allied intelligence and whom Dest quotes, wrote that the appreciations had been tuned to justify Eisenhower's policy of attacking all along the line, and called the failure to forecast the offensive the most spectacular blunder. That is a British officer indicting a system, not an American one being blamed by it. Now the numbers, in one place, because this is where the argument stops being interpretive. The German offensive committed something over 410,000 men, just over 1,400 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, 2,600 artillery pieces, and better than 1,000 aircraft, on the figures in Hitler's Last Gamble, the campaign study by Trevor Dupuy, David Bongard, and Richard Anderson. Against the initial assault, the Allies had 228,741 men in the sector, 483 tanks, and 499 tank destroyers and assault guns. By the 2nd of January, those figures were about 705,000 men, 2,409 tanks, and 1,970 tank destroyers and assault guns. That reinforcement rate is the actual American achievement of the winter, and it is a logistic story, not a heroism story. Cole's official accounting for the 16th of December through the 2nd of January, which he flags himself as probably incomplete, gives 41,315 American battle casualties, 4,138 known killed, 20,231 wounded, 16,946 missing. In the same period, the American formations in the Ardennes absorbed 31,505 replacements, which tells you what kind of arithmetic the theater was running. Armor losses were 471 medium tanks out of 1,882 on hand between 1st and 3rd Armies. By the 2nd of January, the Germans had committed 8 armored divisions, 20 infantry divisions, and 2 mechanized brigades, and the Americans had 8 armored, 16 infantry, and 2 airborne divisions in the line. For the whole battle, on the longer count that runs into late January, the American total is usually given as somewhere between 75,000 and 83,000 casualties, depending on the end date and the accounting, with more than 23,000 taken prisoner, and the Army's own count of American dead for the campaign is frequently cited at 19,246. The spread in those figures is not sloppiness. It reflects genuine disagreement about when the battle ended and which units to count. And any narrator who gives you one clean number for the Bulge is choosing a source without telling you. One figure inside that block deserves to be pulled out on its own because it is the American war almost nobody dramatizes. Set the replacement figure against the casualty figure, and over those 18 days, the theater was putting roughly 3 men back into the line for every 4 it lost in winter, while the battle was still running. The Germans could not replace anybody, and that arithmetic, not the fighting at any one crossroads, is what finished the offensive, so what actually failed. Not the analysts, or not mainly. Cole's verdict in the official history is that the defense was surprised by the speed and the weight of the assault, and that, later protestations to the contrary, the American commands, both high and low, had been deceived as to the point of the attack. Deceived is the correct word, and it is doing real work. The Germans ran a deception operation, and it succeeded, and no amount of retrospective cleverness makes a radio blackout transparent. But I believe the machine had one specific missing part, and I would name it precisely. The system had a doctrine for producing warnings and no doctrine for receiving them. Follow it through. Doctrine told the G2 to publish capabilities, not intentions. Correct. Doctrine told the commander to base his actions on those capabilities. Also correct. And then the system left the entire distance between those two sentences empty. There was no requirement that a headquarters answer a subordinate's estimate. No log of decisions taken against a stated capability. No procedure by which a colonel who believed he was being ignored could force a hearing. No standing obligation on an Army Group G2 to carry a subordinate's warning to his commander, and therefore no record when he did not. Bradley's own sentence about Seibert not being sufficiently impressed is not an excuse. It is a description of a gap in the design that his own memoir preserved by accident. Add the second missing part, which is that nobody was accounting for the cost of being wrong in each direction. An intelligence officer who forecast a German offensive that never came had cost his commander an attack, and he would hear about it and the joke would go up on the wall. An intelligence officer who failed to forecast one that did come cost infantrymen, and the infantrymen were not in the room. Those two errors were not priced the same, and in my view, that asymmetry explains more about December of 1944 than any individual's judgment does. When the punishment for crying wolf is certain, and the punishment for missing a wolf is diffuse, a headquarters will drift toward quiet every time, and give the other side its due, because the honest assessment demands it. Bradley's calculated risk in the Ardennes was a real calculation. Eisenhower's broad front left no reserve to thicken the middle with, and the reason the middle was thin was that both ends were heavy, and both ends were heavy because the strategy said so. That is not idiocy. That is a plan with an assumption buried in it, and the assumption was that a German army in the condition of December 1944 could no longer choose. Every piece of evidence supported that assumption, except the evidence 3 men kept filing. The title of this video says 3 men warned them, and the record supports it as far as it goes. It also shows that not one of the 3 named the whole thing. Dickson had the mechanism and the wrong bracket. Koch had the sector and never claimed the date or the scale. Strong had the ground and the weather and called it a spoiling attack rather than an army group offensive with Antwerp written on the objective line. Put their 3 documents on one table and the picture is nearly complete, and that is the point. Nobody's job was to put them on one table. That is the systemic pattern, and it is not a 1944 pattern. An institution that generates excellent information and has no owner for the seam between 2 reports will be surprised by something it already knew. The Ardennes is the most expensive American demonstration of that principle I know of, and the cost is countable. 2 infantry regiments who surrendered because nobody could reach them. A corps whose center was destroyed inside 4 days. The better part of 2 months of a theater's strength spent putting the line back where it had been on the 15th of December. There is a reason those 3 names are not in the story you were told, and it is not that the documents are lost. The documents are in the green books with page numbers, in a series the government printed and put online. Estimate 37 is quoted in Pogue. Koch's briefing is written up on the Army's own website. Strong's warning is in D'Este and in Pogue's footnotes and in Strong's own memoir. The record is not thin. What the record never had was anybody whose institutional job it was to make the connection between 3 pieces of paper and 1 decision, which is exactly the same absence that produced the battle. 1 last number, 4 of 10. That is how many German divisions the 8th Corps had identified in front of it when the artillery opened on the 16th of December, and I think that is the figure to keep, because it is the only one in this story that measures the gap between what an army knew and what an army could see. The men who wrote the warnings were looking at the 4. The 6 they could not see were the reason the word surprise ever got attached to this battle at all, and the reason it stuck is that surprise is a much easier thing to put in a memoir than a missing procedure. If your father or grandfather served in the 8th Corps that December, in the 106th, the 28th, the 4th or the 9th Armored, or in the intelligence sections at Spa, at Nancy, at Luxembourg, or at Versailles, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and for the staff side of this battle, they are close to the only human record we have. Drop them in the comments. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.